Great. Is this microphone working? I think so. Seems like I'm louder than usual. I do have my attendance sheet, and I also have my running tabulation of the write-ups that I think you have sent to me. It's very much in your interest to make sure that I've got this right. So if I'm missing some, please let me know. And not to get anything started in the class, but I will point out that we have many more write-ups from our MBA students than we do from our engineering students so far. Just saying. Okay, yeah. So I'll pass this around. Welcome to those of you coming in. I'm sorry about the seats. Maybe we can find a chair or two around the corner. Yeah. So here's another one for maybe over in the back corner there, but whoever takes it has to figure out a way to get it to the back corner. Oh, there we go, one taker anyway. Okay, so when life gives you lemons, sometimes you make lemonade. Kareem Lakhani could not be with us here today, so we have him on tape and available to you as of the end of the day today. So in his absence, I'm going to talk to you about open innovation, and I'm going to try to do at least a couple of things. One is I'm going to try to put some historic perspective on this, where these ideas came from, what preceded open innovation, where we are now. I'll also, toward the end of my talk, try to give you my perception of where some of the talks that we've already heard this semester, where they kind of fit in the open innovation model more generally, to kind of give you a meta-level perspective on that as well. I also hope that we have time for questions. So if you've been like saving up something you've been dying to ask about open innovation and haven't known when or what session to do it, this is that session. So I will try to get through my material pretty quickly. I've got a fair amount of it, but I'll try to go through quickly. And if a question comes to mind, let's take those questions right then and there. And then we'll save whatever time at the end for more general discussion and Q&A. Okay? Good. All right. So let's get started. One of the things that helps think about open innovation is an earlier model that preceded it. And I somewhat pejoratively call this a closed innovation model. It is not what was used at the time to describe the earlier models, but it has the property of the lion's share of the innovation activity was done inside the company and its own four walls. And it's a nice rhetorical straw man to pivot to talk about open innovation in contrast. So I'm actually going to start my lecture on open innovation today talking to you about closed innovation. So how does this model work? Well, it's a representation of a company's research and development process. And the way that I'm representing it here is I've got a funnel turned on its side. And you can think of each of these dots in the funnel as a project. And in this model, it's kind of a linear model moving from your left to your right. The projects start from the science and technology base of the organization. That launches a new inquiry, a new project. And in the beginning, the funnel is quite wide, signifying you look at many possibilities. But as you get closer to market and further through the R&D process, there's a lot of this fail early, fail often kind of quality to it. And you narrow down quite substantially from that initially wide set of project possibilities to a much narrower, more focused set of activities to go out to the marketplace. So some of this is research, some of this is development. There's a whole other part of handing this off to the sales and marketing organization, distribution channels and the like that I'm leaving out of this depiction, even though they're obviously important as well. And the reason I labeled a closed process is in this model, all the action is inside the boundary of the firm, shown as this line around the funnel. Now, why start there? Well, it had some very useful properties. One is there was something of a virtuous circle in this model. If you came up with a fundamental technology breakthrough, that could be leveraged in your model to create new products and new features, which would get you more sales and more profit, which would allow you to reinvest in your R&D, which would allow you to make more breakthroughs and so on. This is actually taken from President Roosevelt's scientific advisor during the Second World War, a man named Vannevar Bush, no relation to the later Bushes. And his point was that this massive mobilization during wartime that created radar and sonar and atomic weapons and many, many other technological breakthroughs could be extended in peacetime if the federal government, really for the first time, made massive investments in basic research. And that private industry, armed with that basic research, could then undertake this process. And his report was called Science, the Endless Frontier. And so this idea was how we could create a sustaining, ongoing frontier of knowledge that would ever advance and improve and be self-reinforcing in this way. So this is the basic logic behind the model. And it worked well for a very long time. Most historians would date the original R&D labs to the German chemicals industry in the 19th century, particularly a company called Bayer. And Bayer could do something in their labs that was a tremendous competitive advantage. They could synthesize chemical dyestuffs and make colors that did not exist in nature. So if you want to compete against that, how do you compete against something that can't be found in nature? Well, it turned out the other chemicals companies had to compete by creating their own R&D capabilities, learning how to synthesize chemical dyestuffs themselves, and then offer up their own responses to this. And indeed, in the United States, DuPont was the first of the major chemical companies to take that model of Bayer, bring it over to the US in the late 19th century. Independently, Thomas Edison, who we think of sometimes as this lone inventor, was actually quite the corporate guy. His labs in Menlo Park, New Jersey were the forerunners of GE's laboratory system for General Electric. Even the original John D. Rockefeller, who built the Standard Oil monopoly in petroleum, part of what helped him build the monopoly was when he would go around and buy up these smaller oil companies, he had the technology and the knowledge in his organization to get more money out of a barrel of oil than anybody else, because they understood better how to crack it, how to refine it, how to purify it, to get better results. So again, a very powerful return on investment for the internal R&D that they had. I already mentioned Vannevar Bush in World War II. A Harvard historian who passed away recently, Alfred Chandler, actually attributes the rise of the American corporation in the 20th century to that corporation's ability to manage both economies of scale and scope through R&D. So not a bad track record for a model. And how did you manage such a model? Well, here were a couple of perspectives. One from the early 20th century from a former president of Harvard University. The key to success is to find a man of genius. You know it's the early 20th century because he said a man. Give him money and leave him alone. But more recently, Alan Kay, the computer scientist now at Disney, who was at Park earlier and has been at Apple and some other companies, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So this is sort of a technology push, start with the best cutting-edge research and go from there, approach to managing innovation. And some of the examples of this, one would be Bell Laboratories, probably the best of the 20th century industrial R&D labs in the world. And this is Britton, Bardeen, and Shockley and their discovery in 1948 of the transistor, which got them the Nobel Prize. Does anybody here know who actually shipped the first product with a transistor off of this discovery? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't AT&T or Bell Labs. It was Sony. That's right. They had a little hearing aid they made, which at the time, hearing aids were these horns that were pretty large and not very convenient. And by using a transistor, they could shrink that device to something you could hang on your ear, and it would help you hear. And Sony was a little tiny startup company in Japan. They had nothing like Bell Laboratories behind them, yet they were the first ones to actually make something out of this new technology. And this is where the edifice begins to crack for the internal R&D model. There are many, many examples. I'm going to show you a couple more in a minute, where the company that invented the technology was not the company that profited from that technology. Somebody else got there ahead of them, even though they invested in it and invented it. So here's Bell Labs, the campus in New Jersey. Over here on the right is IBM's T.J. Watson laboratories. And both of these facilities, if you've ever been to them, are fortresses, almost literally, where the walls are intended to keep the knowledge from leaking out. And they're high up on a hill, especially in the case of the Watson Research Center as well. So you could think of these as knowledge fortresses built by the companies that did this big investment in their own knowledge bases. Another company I looked at was Xerox, in particular their Palo Alto Research Center down in Palo Alto, known as PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. This is a document from PARC from 1996, and it shows you another representation of this funnel that I started with at the beginning of my talk. Again, each of the ovals here is an R&D project, and again, they kind of move from left to right, as you saw before. Now, there are a couple things that you see here that you didn't see on the earlier one. In particular, you see these dotted lines that cut across this project portfolio. These were stage gates, where at across all the projects, when you got to a certain stage of development, each project would be subject to a list of questions. And every project would have to answer these same questions in order to get the money to continue and go to the next stage. So the idea here was this idea of fail fast, fail early. Ask hard questions early on, and if the project doesn't have good answers for it, don't let it keep going. It either has to iterate and try again, or you stop the project and put your resources somewhere else instead. And when I had a chance to interview some of the PARC managers making these evaluations, I learned something about this process that I think is pretty important for what became open innovation. One is the amount of uncertainty that's out there, both about uncertainty in the market and in the capability of the technology. At early stages, you're not really sure what the best market is. I promise you that Britton, Bardeen, and Shockley were not thinking about hearing aids when they developed the transistor. How do you know? Industrial lasers would be another one. We knew how to make lasers long before we knew what to do with them. And it turned out the big killer application for industrial lasers were CD and DVD players. And again, the people who did the laser development had no idea. You're also not sure what the technology is capable of and how quickly it'll develop. So you have a lot of uncertainty. But you've got to make some commitments and decisions based on, in a highly uncertain environment, and in an early stage, you've got relatively little information. So when you put these two together, incomplete information and underlying uncertainty, you're going to get what is called measurement error by the statisticians. Many of you are familiar with measurement error. It comes in two types. There's the type 1 false positive error, or the type 2 false negative error. Now, these are not bad management decisions. These are good decisions being done the best they can, but in an environment of uncertainty and incomplete information. If you want to try, good luck. That's, you're 10, 15 minutes late, guys. So as you go through here, a false positive would be a project that gets to one of these gates. All these questions get asked, and the project is approved, and it continues on to the next phase. And again, more questions are asked of that project. It again passes the hurdle, goes on to the next phase. Further questions are asked. It passes. It goes out into the marketplace and fails. That's the false positive. So it looked good all the way through. On all the criteria we were asking, it passed all of them. But when it went out into the marketplace, the market voted differently. So these are very expensive errors to make, and you can be sure that when these projects go all the way through and fail, a lot of hard questions are asked after the fact about, did we ask the right questions here? Do we need to change any of the questions, and so forth? So companies like Xerox and many others worked hard to avoid repeating the false positive errors. And you can see why. It's an expensive error to make. What Xerox didn't do, and what most companies I've encountered don't do, is they don't think about and they don't manage the other kind of error, the false negative error. Now, a false negative error is a project that gets to one of these reviews and it doesn't pass. So there's no further funding provided to the project. So at that point, the funding stops. The people often get pulled off and redeployed onto other things. And the company often never will know what would have happened if we had continued. All they know is the money stopped, so the project stopped. From my knowledge of PARC and its history, I knew that some of the projects that had started inside of PARC had gone on outside of Xerox to do interesting things. So I actually set about studying 35 research projects among the 5 research labs that Xerox maintained. And my research goal was to find out for each of these 35 projects what happened to the project after the internal funding was stopped. So in a sense, I was looking for potential false negatives in the study. So I went off to do that. And here's what I learned. Recall I started with 35 of them. Most of the projects, about 25 of the 35, were allowed to go outside. They actually were legally incorporated. That was part of my requirement to be in the sample. They got some level of funding to get started. At least one Xerox researcher went with them. This was true of all 35 projects. But 25 of the 35, after they went outside, failed. So we might think of these, if you will, as true negatives. They didn't seem useful inside of Xerox, so they were stopped. When they went outside and raised outside money, they still failed. However, 10 of the 35 projects succeeded, and some of them succeeded wildly. And that's what this graph shows you here. So here are the 10 projects that really became publicly traded companies in their own right. And some of them, like Adobe and 3Com and others, were big successes. And if you add up the market value of these public companies, you get this blue line here, which is this one starting in the early 80s. And for comparison, I'm comparing it to Xerox's own market value. And that's the number of Xerox shares multiplied by the price of each share. That product gets you the market value of the company. So here's the market value of the 10 projects in comparison to Xerox. And by the early 90s, it crosses. And by the end of my study, it was more than 2 times the market value. So even though these projects looked unpromising inside of Xerox, when they went outside and got independent funding and so forth, they were able to be successful. I later came to understand that one of the key differences in this was the difference in the business model that was used for these projects. So it's not that the projects themselves completely transformed themselves. Rather, what it was the projects were commercialized through a very different business model than the one that was inside of Xerox, which at the time of this study was making copiers and printers. So Xerox was actually quite skilled at mining technologies out of their R&D labs that could make more copies, make them faster, make them higher quality, help fold and staple and collate and all that stuff, double-sided, duplex, all that good copier stuff. They did a great job of extracting technologies from their R&D labs wherever it fit their business model very well. But these failed projects, the ones that got stopped, didn't fit that business model. The question was, would there be an alternative business model that might make them more valuable? And Xerox, and this is where I think it's true of most companies, Xerox had no process to consider such a question. And they certainly had no process to experiment with alternative business models to find a better way or an alternative way to pursue the project. So it created a great deal of value, but very little of that value went to the shareholders of Xerox, the people who paid for the research that led to these projects. So you see why this is problematic for the closed model. The people that fund the invention aren't the people who capture the rewards at the end. So our virtuous circle I was showing you is starting to break down. And this gets to the logic in the closed model. When these assumptions are met, the closed model is a very effective model and a self-sustaining model economically. The first of these is, if I discover it, I'll find a market for it. Now, we've already mentioned Bell Labs with the transistor and industrial lasers. There are plenty of examples where somebody invents something, but they can't find a market. The technology works, but who's going to buy it? For a long time, in the early 90s, people thought the internet was such a technology because we were passing packets around DoD labs and supercomputing centers in academia long before there were any business models around. It wasn't until Netscape and the Netscape browser that we actually had the first internet business model, and that came out in 1994. The internet had been around since the mid to late 80s. It was only when the business model got going that we began to see how to make money from it. The second subject is really interesting too. If I discover it first, I'll own it. That means I have the IP. That means I can limit or exclude you from following me or copying me. If the first two assumptions are met, we have a market and we own it, we have a temporary legal monopoly. Temporary legal monopolies are very profitable businesses, easy to sustain, at least until the patent protection ends. But when their assumptions are not met, if I invent something but you get to copy or invent around me or follow after me, I've taken the initial risk, and my reward is I get to share the market with everybody else who comes in after me. That's a more problematic result for the closed model. The next assumption is also important. I know what's important. You know, I find the man of genius and I leave him alone because he'll figure out what's important. Or we'll predict the future by inventing it. We know what's going to be important here. But a lot of very important fundamental technologies don't come from such a process. They often emerge from seemingly unlikely places. And so some of the big corporate R&D labs of the past 50 years, for example, have been only minor players in some of the biggest technological developments out there. Can you think of any examples? It looks like you have a thought. Yes? No? Okay.
I do, but
well, tell me.
I was thinking about Apple in the first place, you know, back in when they were startups, sort of.
Yeah.
Sort of. I don't know how to put it. I'll form a little bit later if you continue.
Okay. So think of the human genome and the sequencing of the human genome. There was no corporate laboratory that led that, if you accept Celera. Celera was a big piece of that. But all the big pharma laboratories, and they were spending billions and billions, each company was spending billions and billions of dollars. Think back to last week's talk from Stephen Friend. They were doing a lot of incremental work, but the fundamental work was coming from the universities and from public science and other places. Think of the internet that I referenced before. That was coming out of the defense and university environments, not the corporate laboratories. So sometimes the important stuff isn't anticipated in advance. And the last one is the best people work for us. This is a corollary to finding the man of genius, is you want to get as many of these as you can, put them on your payroll, and then wait for them to be brilliant, and then you make the money. But these days, there's too many very good, very smart people everywhere. And if you can't get all the smart people working for you, the closed model gets you focused too much on what yourself are doing and pays too little attention to what others are doing outside your environment, things that might be very valuable for you going forward. Some data to support some of this are data on where R&D spending is actually taking place. And so, as I've said to you so far qualitatively, there was an earlier closed innovation era where most of the action was inside these big R&D labs, and it's giving way to a new, more open approach. Well, these are data from the National Science Foundation on R&D spending, so each of these years adds up to 100%. And what I've done is I've captured the R&D spending by the size of the company doing the spending. So in the first of the selected years, in 1981, more than 70% of all the R&D spending in the US was done in companies of more than 25,000 employees. This is quite consistent with that closed innovation model I was telling you about. In that same year, in 1981, The smallest companies, taken all together of less than 1,000 people, collectively amounted to less than 5% of the R&D spending in that year. So if you're sitting in one of these companies looking for the new breakthroughs, the cutting edge stuff, the stuff that's really going to be important to you, you tend not to pay a lot of attention. Because remember, this is spread over millions of businesses. However, if we go forward in time, the largest businesses today now account for about 35% of R&D spending. So they're still important, and they're still a big part of the system, but they're by no means the dominant factor they were in earlier times. And those smallest companies that were kind of negligible back here are nearly a quarter of all the R&D spending now. Okay, good. So I've got some questions. Yes?
I was just wondering, has there been a change in the company size in the same period?
No, these are the same categories of employees. The NSF does report, they have smaller categories below this, for example, that they break out.
Are there more of the smaller companies now?
Oh, I see what you're asking. Okay, that's a different question. Okay. So there's a couple of demographic things going on. Some of the companies that were here are now here. Think of Intel and Microsoft. Teeny tiny companies back here, major corporations over here. On the other hand, there are more people working in smaller companies here than there were back here as well. But in a sense, that's kind of part of my point. There's more going on in the smallest companies. So there are some demographics things shifting. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, just a follow-up on this one, actually. It's one of two things, right? Whether there is more small companies or small companies are investing more.
Right. So it is not the case that we have 5.5 times as many small companies, nor is it the case that we have 1/2 as many here. But if you look at aggregate R&D spending for these guys here, from this period to here, from 89 to 2007, in constant dollars, if you take inflation out, it's about the same amount of money. So all of the growth in R&D spending since the late 80s has come in these less than the largest companies. And if you were looking at patenting and who's getting issued patents, you'd see a similar trend. And if you looked at employment, you'd see a similar trend as well. So the point I'm making here is that what was a more closed environment where the biggest companies were the most important players is giving way to a more distributed environment where even the smallest companies collectively are now a big part of what's going on. And I want to just get this microphone going so we can get your questions on tape too, if I can turn it on. Yeah, there we go.
So if I understood well, the main point is that you need less of a critical mass to be able to innovate, right? You don't need to be big anymore.
Well, all I'm showing you here are data on where R&D spending has taken place. Okay. What inferences we make from that I'm going to sketch going forward. All I'm saying is that this is a pattern that supports the story I'm telling to you. So I'm giving you a narrative. I'm trying to give you some supporting points for the narrative. Yes?
You think acquisition of small companies by large companies would change this picture a lot? Because large corporates, even though they're not investing in internal R&D, might be buying small startups.
But keep in mind, when Cisco goes out and buys lots of small companies, that pulls people from here into here. So that would actually that should push the data the other way once the company's bought. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that could be considered as an R&D spending by large corporates as well, right?
Right, but the point is that would be captured here, and it would make this number bigger than it is. Or this number includes the acquisitions that Microsoft makes, that Cisco makes, all the rest, those things. Once they're acquired, I should say. Because the acquisition event itself would be an asset transaction. These are annual R&D expenditures reported to the NSF.
Would it be like that before in 1981 there were more like a shotgun approach to things? With R&D, you're sort of having a wider spectrum of all the funding you're used, when you're actually, compared to now in 2007, the companies use only 35.2. Are they more sort of at the point compared to in 1981 that perhaps they were having a wider scale of R&D? Or is it just due to open innovation and smart?
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you my explanation in just a moment. I can see, having given you guys some data, you're hungry to interpret it for me. So I will offer you my interpretation in just a minute.
We might be talking about this later, but how much of this is due to the shift in the focus of 1981, there would be a lot of manufacturing-based companies that have a lot of employees, whereas now there are more companies that tend to be smaller but still need to do a lot of R&D, such as internet companies and things like that. So have you looked at what this would look like based on the market cap of the company, or like how much revenue they make?
So I've not done the market cap comparison. That would be interesting. One of the factors that could contribute to this effect, that I think is part of your question, would be outsourcing. If instead of doing things in R&D inside your own organization, you start to farm out the R&D to small organizations, that might cause R&D spending to be reported here, and now you, the large company, are contracting for R&D here. So that's a possibility. Unfortunately, the NSF doesn't keep data on that, so you can't measure that directly. On the other hand, these data are R&D performed in the US, so this doesn't capture offshoring, whether done by you or by somebody else. These are R&D activities in the US that I'm reporting here.
So two things. One is, my impression is that large companies have been more subject to, that is, I think part of this is due to not the expansion of R&D in small companies, but that big companies have cut back on their R&D, which is part of it. And the other thing is, I suspect this overstates it, because I think that if you look at defense contractors, they're probably all in that the big defense contractors, Lockheed, Northrop, are all in that big category there. They do lots of, quote, R&D, but I don't think it produces much in the way of, it just produces a new airplane or something, new weapon systems, which doesn't really contribute to the industrial base of the country.
So yes, I've said nothing here yet about innovation outcomes. This is an input measure. This is R&D spending only. So it could be, and there's actually an academic debate on, are large firms more innovative or less innovative than small firms? Are defense firms less or more innovative than civilian firms, and so on? These data don't speak to any of those things. So since you're curious for my interpretation, rather than taking every question, let me move a little further, because this actually isn't where I want to focus my discussion with you today. I actually think what I'm explaining here is pretty well accepted by everybody. There's not a lot of argument, and if you think about all the talks you've heard today, or to the class so far, you've heard nothing in the course so far that disagrees with anything that we've been saying. So these are not controversial issues. We will get to some controversies in a bit. This is not among them. So here's my interpretation for why we see the shift. And I will point to 5 things. Are there other things you can think of? Well, think of your own list while I go through this. One that's happened that I think has changed is the mobility of the workforce. It used to be when people graduated from universities and went to work in a large company, they would spend their entire career in that company. And they would retire and get the gold watch and their handshake, and that was 30 or 35 years at one single company. These days, it's quite common for the engineers in the US to have 9 employers, different employers, over their career. So that's 8 different occasions where they leave one organization and go somewhere else. And that's the average. You probably already know people who are already at or above that average already. So the mobility of workers, I think, is much higher now. Now, what's behind that? There are a lot of factors. If you're interested, we can explore it. But again, this is not a particularly controversial point. Everybody agrees that workforce mobility has grown quite a bit in the last 40 or 50 years. The second one is also interesting, is the attitude of universities toward industrial research. With the rise of Vannevar Bush and Science, the Endless Frontier, and in particular during the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, there was a huge infusion of federal spending into universities for natural and physical sciences and even for the social sciences. So these are kind of the glory years where the government was providing huge amounts of money to the university sector, and also enrollment in universities really boomed with the GI Bill and the things that brought people from the military into the civilian workforce. So it was a great way to demobilize your big army that fought World War II and get them onto productive private jobs in the 1950s and 1960s. So all this is going on. And so in the 1950s and 60s, the universities were getting all the money they needed from the government. They didn't really have to care about industry very much. I mean, sure, they would train the people that would go to industry, but they didn't really need industry funding. And they weren't maybe all that interested in what industry was doing because they were working with their peers on peer-reviewed studies that their colleagues would review, all funded by the government. Well, once by the 1980s, that train of funding really started to slow down. And by contrast, industry funding began to rise. And so what happened in the universities, you saw a real mindset shift in places like Berkeley or Stanford or MIT or pick your favorite universities, where universities that were used to be disdainful or suspicious of working too closely with industry, over time began to embrace it more and more. Exhibit A would be the president of Stanford University, the second most prestigious university in California. That is a guy named John Hennessy, a very well-known computer scientist, a highly respected former dean of the engineering school at Stanford, a tremendous academic career. This same guy is a 3-time serial entrepreneur. He has taken 3 different leaves of absence to start up companies. And he actually still today sits on the board of Google. He's the university president at Stanford. He's running the place. A generation ago, that would not have been thinkable for an elite leading university. To have somebody with that much commercial background and experience, unbecoming to a university. These days, I think it's a new model for what we're going to see in universities. Because more and more of the funding outside of the life sciences, more funding is now coming for research from industry than it is coming from the government. So if that's where the money's coming from, even university professors can realize we have to actually change how we frame and focus the work that we're doing. So that's the second factor that I think has really changed. A third factor, the US, after the World War II period, was almost half of world GDP for a time. Today, we're down now around 22, 23%. So we've fallen a lot in the last 30 years, relatively speaking. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, by the way. I don't think it was sustainable for 5% of the world's population to have 50% of the world's GDP. Not sustainable. But what it does mean is that what was, all the leading industries used to start in the US, that's not the case anymore. You can go to, sorry?
Chemistry was still heavily focused in Germany.
Well, all I'm saying is that if you look today, you can go to countries like Finland, Taiwan, small, tiny Israel, small countries, and find in populations of 5 or 6 million people, better cell phone technologies, better battery technologies, better car technologies, lots of new materials and material science applications, all emerging ahead of what's going on in the US. So if you're looking for where the best knowledge is in the world today, it truly is a global search, not one that you could restrict in not every field, but in most fields you could look at the US. Or if you look in scientific journals, even as recently as the mid-80s, 2/3 of the papers published in physics review letters were from people working in the US. Today that statistic is less than 1/3. Less than 1/3 of the papers published in that journal are coming from physicists working in the US. More than 2/3 are published by people working outside the US. This is all I'm saying. Again, not a controversial point. I'll skip antitrust, although that did play a role in breaking up some of the monopolies like the AT&T Bell system and IBM and so forth. But I don't want to skip venture capital. Because venture capital in 1981, when I showed you those data, was a tiny cottage industry. A dozen or a couple dozen firms with collectively $1 or maybe $2 billion under management. Today, there are trillions of dollars under management in VC firms. There are hundreds of VC firms all over the world doing it. And remember, venture capital does not pay for research. Venture capital only pays for development. No R, only D. So the R has to start somewhere else. Sometimes it starts in a university. Sometimes it's individuals getting going. Or it's somebody leaving a large company and starting up their own activity, like that workforce mobility we started talking about. But in all cases, you won't find a venture capital firm with their own laboratories and their own bench scientists high up on a hill in those big, beautiful buildings like Bell Labs and IBM. You'll never find that. They're in office parks. And a good-sized VC firm might have 20 people. That's a good mid-sized VC firm. The biggest firms I know are maybe 50, maybe 60, tops. The biggest ones that I know of. So this is not a place where the internal research is coming out of the VC labs. They are funding activities that were started elsewhere. So it creates a gap between research on the one hand and development on the other hand. So now we start to see markets between R and D. Think of biotech firms as a great example of this. The biotech industry typically starts out of university researchers, one or more professors and one or more grad students go off and start up a company to pursue one or more compounds. They get some venture funding because the research was already done. And then if they're lucky, they'll get a deal with a pharma company if they get to a phase 2A trial. And then the pharma company will buy the rights and take it to market from there. So the VCs get their exit at the phase 2A transaction. The founders get cashed out, and then the pharma company takes it from there. So what was a marathon from the laboratory to the market inside a big firm is now a relay race with a baton being passed at different points to different players with different funding. So this is what I think is going on in that transition I showed you. Now, I can't prove it isn't something else. That's one of the weaknesses of this story, is that this is my account. I think it's a persuasive account, but it's hard to convince somebody it isn't something else instead. But what it does do is it breaks that virtuous circle, because now when you have a technology breakthrough, people can leave and form their own company. That's that mobility we were talking about. They can now get funding from the venture capital folks, and typically the VCs will fund them not to do the same thing that the big company in the industry is already doing. They typically get funded to try a different kind of a business model. Now, most of the time, it fails. Hence, rest in peace. So I'm not trying to suggest every time this goes, it's a big success. But even in the cases where it works and there's an IPO or an acquisition, you don't see most of these organizations, again, with a few exceptions, but most of them don't reinvest in basic R&D to restart the cycle. They start going out looking for acquisitions and other things to bring in that other people have developed. And what that does, whether they live or die, is that it breaks that virtuous self-sustaining cycle. So one of the challenges in this open model I'm describing to you is, where does the funding for basic research come from in this model? In the old days, IBM and AT&T and others would reinvest for their own selfish interests because they could capitalize on it later on. In this new model, everybody's racing to find the new stuff or pick off the key engineers and hire them, or try to hang on to your engineers. If you're in a big company, you're trying to keep them. Where does the basic technology get funded in all this? And my answer is the university has to become the locus of basic research in this new model. It didn't have to before. Now it really does.
When you say that key engineers exit and form a new company, doesn't the company that they're currently working for have the intellectual property rights, and how do the engineers take it with them?
Right. So this is back to the question of the IP, and also the employment agreements and things like that. So there are constraints on people leaving. So if you have worked on stuff in your company's equipment, on the company's time, you're on the company's payroll, and you've documented this and the company's got your documentation, they can come after you. But people know this, and so people know if they're thinking of something new, they work on it themselves, they work on it in the garage, they work on it at night, they don't write it down in the company's notebooks, they don't use the company's equipment. And if you're doing it on your own time, in the shower, on the weekend, at home, in the garage, etc., it's well established, that's yours, it's not the company's. In California, there are even cases that have been pretty egregious where people have left a company like IBM, gone to a company like Seagate in the disk drive industry, taken the thin film head program with them, and funnily enough, a year later, Seagate Technology suddenly has thin film heads. And IBM sued because they had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this, and one of their big competitors has the technology a year later, and they sure didn't do all the research in 1 year and ship it. But in the California courts, they held that the person's right to practice his trade trumped the right of the company to its IP. Now, that would be a different ruling in Delaware and other places, but all of which is to say companies can't lock up their people. Now, if we go to China, companies, the multinationals in China with R&D labs in China tell me their annual turnover out of their R&D labs is 20 or 25% each year. So that means every 4 or 5 years, it's a whole new lab in terms of people. So in that environment, it's very challenging to hang on to what you got. And if you want to try to go after people to keep them from leaving, good luck. So for sure, you don't want to bet your strategy on being able to lock up your employees. That would be a bad idea. Okay, so we don't have the virtuous cycle going anymore. And I'm not the only one that's observed this, by the way. And I think, Joanna, you made note of this in your paper to me recently. Merck, an incredibly respected scientific company in the life sciences, maybe the Bell Labs of its industry, at least back in 2000 when they wrote this, came to the conclusion there's too much going on for us to do it ourselves. We're maybe 1% of the biomedical research out in the world. How do we get to the other 99%? And there's just too much to do ourselves. We've got to open up. We've got to find ways to ally, to collaborate, to take advantage of all the other stuff we can't hope to do ourselves. Bill Joy has another way of thinking about it. Not all the smart people work for you. Now, Bill Joy is a Berkeley PhD grad in computer science. He's the founder of Stanford University Network, which is Sun Microsystems. That's Sun, Stanford University Network. What's he doing today? He's a venture capitalist at Kleiner Perkins. So even the arc of his own career is kind of an interesting example of what I'm talking about. So we need to think differently about innovation. We need a new model. For all the reasons I've just given you, the closed model doesn't work in most cases because there's too much worker mobility, the IP protection is not strong enough to lock it up. You've got the venture capitalists eagerly shoveling money to anybody who's good, who can take ideas that have been developed to a certain stage and now are ready to be commercialized, and so forth. So for all these reasons, we need a new model. As it happens, the best representation that I've seen of this is not one that I came up with. It's actually one that came from a guy in Sweden named Bengt Jarrahult. And it says here, stolen with pride from Professor Henry Chesbrough. And Bengt has given me permission to steal it back and share it with you. So here's Bengt's depiction of this idea. In the closed innovation model, you aim your R&D process at your current market. That's what you're targeting. And you really don't have a method to focus on other markets or other business models. You're really aiming for your business model. And you're filtering things that fit your model, and you're excluding things that don't fit, much as you saw with the park example I showed you a little bit ago. With open innovation, the first thing you do is drill holes in your funnel, the holy funnel. But now it's H-O-L-E-Y. And the idea of the holes in the funnel is what was this impermeable barrier is now a semi-permeable membrane for things to flow in and out throughout the R&D process. And with a holy funnel, you have many pathways for ideas to get to the marketplace. There still is the good old-fashioned internal one, but that's just one path in the more general model now. Sometimes you'll have internal ideas that don't fit what you're doing. Those should be allowed to go outside for others to use in their business instead. In other cases, you might bring some external technology that you didn't have originally in your technology base, marry it to something you do have, and go after a new market you couldn't have gotten to if you had restricted yourself only to your internal technology. In some cases, you can even bring external technologies in at a later stage, closer to the market, and fill a gap in your business, in your own business model. So sometimes it's useful for that. And then the last one is one that starts inside, gets to a certain stage of development, is stopped on the inside, but the people want to keep working on it, so they're allowed to go outside. And if they find something that's really interesting to the parent company, they can then get spun back in later on. So you could think of that as a spin in rather than a spin out, if you see what I'm saying. Yes?
I have a question. Is it possible to put different funnels? For example, if you have one development internal and it gets out of your funnel and gets in another company's funnel and gets
Yeah, in fact, that is what's going on in this case. And in fact, in the some of the charts I have for the 2003 book, I show side-by-side funnels of two companies where you see some of those interactions. So yes, that is possible. Because in a sense, when you go outside of your funnel, you're getting funding from a VC and you're starting up your own funnel, or maybe you're working in somebody else's funnel, but there's still funnels out there. There's still R&D going on. So now we're ready for the definition of all this. Now I've asked you in each of the talks to listen for how each of the presenters defines open innovation. So I won't make you guess. I'm going to actually tell you my definition of it. And here it is. It's only one sentence, albeit it's got a lot of words to it, but it's only one sentence. So it basically looks at inflows and outflows of knowledge, but not the accidental inflows and outflows that economists call spillovers. In a sense, you can think of open innovation as saying instead of spillovers from the closed model, which were unintentional and unmanaged, let's now manage those knowledge flows, both coming in and going out. Let's manage them purposively, on purpose. And let's use those to do one or both of two things. Let's accelerate our internal innovation by bringing external things in as well. So we have a bigger intake and we can bring things in closer to the market from outside as well. So that gets us to market faster ourselves. Or expand the markets for external uses of those technologies outside our own business model. Either or both of those are a part of this. So that's what this definition of open innovation says. So if anybody asks you what open innovation says, you can say, well, I don't know, but here's what Chesbrough says it is. And then you can decide for yourselves for your final paper, in fact, what you think it is. So there's a different logic here. Instead of we know who the smart people are, instead of we have all the good ideas, we can control and protect all of our stuff, the starting place is quite different. Good ideas are widely distributed. No one has a monopoly on useful knowledge. That is the starting place of the open model. That is a given from which you innovate. Rather than fighting it or lamenting it, it's a fact of life, and that's where you begin the process. That means we've got to think about how we play both the false positives, but especially the false negatives, this idea of playing poker. I'll say a little bit more about that. We're going to have to think about intellectual property. It is important to us, but it isn't just a one-directional idea. We actually are going to want to access external IP for ourselves, and we want to profit from our IP in other models. And I should have had a third point. We're also going to want to create broad areas of intellectual commons that we can draw from and feed off of, ourselves and others. So we're going to think about IP in a broader sense than before. And because good ideas are everywhere, we know that not all the smart people work for us. But in the open innovation model, you still need smart people. This is one of the misconceptions some people have about it. Some people think of open innovation as just being about outsourcing and getting, hire somebody else's smart people. No. You need your own smart people because they are the ones who will have the knowledge and the training and the experience to recognize and validate the work being done by others and then be able to work with it and collaborate with it, build upon it, etc. Your purchasing organization cannot do this for you. You've got to have your own very, very smart people to make this process work well. And then we think about R&D in a different context. We used to have the idea of what was called the not invented here syndrome. Have you all heard of this, the not invented here? If we didn't do it, it must not be very good. Or if we didn't think of it, it must not be very important. That was the attitude of a very strong, proud, closed R&D organization. The suggestion here is we need a new mindset, a mindset that says, hey, look what I found. Isn't this great? We can use this. We can value this. So think in a company, if you get a patent on something you've worked on, your company typically gives you some cash. They'll bronze the first page of the patent when it issues, and they'll give that to you to put on your wall. And if you get 5 or 10 of them, you actually get into some kind of a club, and you get more recognition and so forth. All that's for the stuff we create ourselves. Nothing wrong with that. but we should have an equal celebration and recognition of things that we find and build on and collaborate with outside. And most companies don't have these rewards in place yet. So we reward the internal stuff, we don't reward the externally sourced stuff. And that's one of the problems in implementing this model. The reward systems start to change. So now we'll look at some funnels. As I hope you're getting by now, there are two parts to the open innovation model. The first part I call the outside-in part of the model. This is all the stuff that fits with your business, your market, your business model. And the suggestion for the first part of the model is let's open up the intake, not only at the beginning stages, but at later stages. Let's be much more open, much more collaborative, much more engaged, etc. So that's why you see lots of arrows coming from lots of places, all in the service of your market and business model. That's the first half of the model. As I'll say to you in a minute, many of our presenters have talked about open innovation as this. And I'm saying this is half of the model. Some of the presenters are saying this is open innovation. And I think they're half right. Because there's another half of the model. And the other half of the model is the inside-out half. And to be fair, the inside-out half of the model is less explored academically, and it's less practiced by many of the people that are talking about open innovation. So I think it's actually an area where there's a lot of opportunity to do new work, because I think it's still relatively less explored. But what the inside-out part is, okay, some of the stuff we work on is going to go to our market. That's fine. That was the other one, the outside-in. What about the stuff that doesn't fit our model? What about letting it go to somebody else's funnel and letting them have at it? And over time, by the way, when we see what other companies are doing and what business models they create, that might give us some insight to a new business model for ourselves down the road. This is a very powerful way to experiment with other people's money on new business models for you. So you license these things out, you divest them, you maybe form joint ventures, etc. You let them take the further risk and see what they do. You get to watch every step of the way, and when you see things that work, you've got other things coming out of your R&D system. You now see what happened there. Maybe there's something you can learn from that for how you treat future projects yourself. Maybe there's a new business model out there for you. And it's the best kind of market research you can buy. Companies love to hire consultants to help them with what is sometimes called strategic innovation or new sources of growth, new businesses, new business development. This is the great thing about this is when one of these projects goes out to somebody else, you've got a real company that pays real money for a real product that sells to a real customer. It's the best market research you can get. And best of all, they paid for it. So I think there's a lot here that people haven't taken advantage of. So let's think about where we've been in the class so far. If we had Kareem here, Kareem would also be talking about outside-in open innovation. So when you see his tape, you'll see it here as well. So Kevin Boudreau clearly focused on crowdsourcing, the idea of getting a community of people to contribute ideas to feed into you. John Rose actually comes up on both sides, depending on whether he's at Huawei or whether he's at Nortel. Now, Huawei, to be fair, is creating an incubator, and you can think of an incubator over here. But most of what John talked about in the context of Huawei is how to broaden the intake for Huawei in its businesses. Alf Bingham and Innocentive, all about outside in. Somebody, a seeker, comes up with an idea that needs to be solved. They go out to this huge community to bring in ideas, and they go through a vetting and a competition to select the best one. All on the outside coming in. And Kjeld Larsen from Copenhagen Business School, again, talking about these outside-in mechanisms. So we have the majority of our speakers, and this is true more generally, the majority of academic papers that have been written on this topic are all in this vein of outside-in innovation. And there's Not a thing wrong with any of it, which is indeed why I invite them to come talk to us. I think it's very important, interesting stuff. My one complaint with some of them is they talk about it as though it's the totality of open innovation, and it's not. There's a lot more going on. In particular, some stuff we've heard over on the inside out. So Vicky Gonzalez talking about the Nidus Partnership, forming a corporate venture capital structure with corporate partners to give her money to go out and look for ideas that could be funded and developed outside the corporate processes. So this is a case where they're actually trying to create a mechanism to stimulate entrepreneurship outside the Monsantos, the Ralston Purinas, the other big funders that they have. When John Rose was talking about his experience at Nortel, remember that big patent portfolio that Nortel built? Remember all the money they got for those patents? All the rest? That is all inside out activity. So he actually has been on both sides of this. And this is, the Nortel side was more exemplary of this. And then Stephen Friend from last week from Sage. All about creating a commons, trying to open up and share tools, data, studies, standardize things that can be open and shared, etc. Taking his own knowledge from his experience both in academic medicine and then in the pharmaceutical industry, and trying to use that to open up the innovation processes in pharma. So in fairness, he could be here and here on both sides again as well. So that's kind of my sense of what we've heard so far on the term in the course. So I'm going to pause, see if anybody has. So maybe what I'll do, if you're with me so far, is I'll start to give you some examples. We're still in good time, so I think I'm going to be all right on time. So here's some examples I'm going to explore with you. I'll give you 4, and then we can talk informally about others if you like. We'll start with IBM. IBM was founded in 1914, but they had their first R&D facility after the conclusion of the Second World War at Columbia University in New York City. And Thomas Watson Sr. was actually on the board of overseers of Columbia University at the time. So that's how Columbia got picked. So that's where IBM opens up its first R&D center. By the 1960s, IBM is really committed to doing fundamental scientific research. And if you look inside their industrial R&D labs, they actually have a department of mathematics, a department of physics, engineering. They actually mirrored the academic functions of the universities they were collaborating with. So they really went a long way toward trying to mimic and connect with the fundamental science in universities. And they had a tremendous number of achievements in what they did. However, many of these did not turn out to be achievements for IBM commercially. The relational database is a fascinating one. Our friends at Oracle really are the ones who made the most money out of that. And part of the reason was IBM had an earlier database program that was incompatible with the... yeah, exactly. And so all the applications IBM's customers were having to use were going to have to be rewritten to run on a relational database. And you can imagine how the IBM salespeople and the IBM customers felt about that. You know, what a nightmare. Well, Oracle, brand new company, no install base, no customer base. Here's the technology. They grab it and go. Same thing happens with reduced instruction set computing. IBM does a lot of the fundamental work, but our friends at Sun and Hewlett-Packard, for similar reasons again, it was incompatible, had to be all rewritten. They steal a march and bet on it because IBM had very big, successful companies that were customers that didn't like it. So in some sense, you could think of both of these as kind of disruptive technologies for IBM. In the industry I know best, IBM was the pioneer in the technologies of both magnetoresistive and giant magnetoresistive materials for disk drive heads that let you get 10 times the areal density on a spinning disk. So these were big quantum jumps in capacity. But IBM was slow to implement, slow to execute. And through that lawsuit I was telling you about, the Seagate, not some of the others, we hired away IBM's people, and we got into production before IBM did. So IBM had great research, but it was slow. It was a long, long way from the needs of the market because this was very fundamental work, and it was expensive. And ultimately, IBM couldn't sustain that commitment going forward because in 92 and 93, IBM had their near-death experience where they lost, I think at that time, the largest loss in US corporate history. Now, WorldCom and Enron have since set new standards for corporate losses. But prior to that time, this was the winner. They laid off more than 30,000 people, the first time in the life that they'd had a major layoff. For the first time, they brought in a CEO from outside the business. They made big cuts in their research funding. And then the question is, how do we avoid getting rid of it altogether? So they've developed a different model at IBM to do it. And this is kind of what happened. Before 93, whether you were at the atomic level or all the way through to software and solutions, everything IBM did came from Big Blue. And it was all sold to you by an IBM sales rep, and serviced by a sales rep, and financed by a sales rep. Everything was IBM. It was deep vertical integration. Because of the crisis, IBM opened up a whole set of OEM markets in parallel to the vertical stack of activities for the first time. So you can now buy IBM disk drives, for example, from IBM and compete against IBM's PC business. So Apple, in their portable business, was actually the first customer for IBM's 2.5-inch disk drive. So at the PC level, IBM hated it because now Apple was competing with them with their own technology. But at the disk drive level, it's like, hey, we have a much bigger market now. We can ship a lot more volume. And if you can ship a lot more volume, that spreads your costs a lot more, gets your costs internally down a lot, and so on. And at the very top of the stack, this whole systems integration business that IBM used to only do for its own stuff now becomes IBM Global Services and is now available to everybody. And this has been a huge success for them, and more than half of the company's revenue comes from IBM Global Services now. And the new CEO, a woman named Gina Rometty, came from IBM Global Services. And the guy before her came from IBM Global Services. So not only are they at the top of the stack, they are at the top of the organization as well, running the place. So if you think about IBM and the open innovation model, they do a lot of internal technology still. They still lead the world in the number of US patents received from the US Patent and Trademark Office. And they've done this now for like 16 years in a row. So they have not gotten rid of internal technology. They still do a lot of internal R&D. Again, it's not about outsourcing and getting rid of it all. But they do a lot of stuff externally that they didn't used to do. So I've mentioned a couple of programs here, Java and Linux, that I suspect many of you are familiar with. And IBM does not own or control either of these, but IBM has more people working on these than practically any other company. So why would IBM put so many of its own staff on a piece of technology that they don't own? Why would they do that? Have they suddenly become nice? And they just want to give back to the world? Is that what they're doing? I will remind you this is a business school class, even though we're in engineering. Is that what they're doing? What are they doing then?
Opportunities to spin out. They're providing themselves opportunities to spin out companies from their internal human resources.
Well, that would be the idea of internal things going to the outside. And they do that. So we're going to get to that. But here, it's already outside. So IBM is taking its own resources and putting them on external projects. That's the thing that's interesting. And not just one or two people. They've got hundreds of people working on these projects. So the question is, why?
Well, IBM did have an operating system program called OS/2, and that wasn't very successful. And then they went to Microsoft, and Microsoft became a big competitor to them in all kinds of software. And so Linux was essentially a vehicle by which they could appropriate a lot of intellectual property that other people had developed. And they kicked in stuff to make it run better on their machines and run better in general and stuff like that. I'm less familiar with their activities in Java.
So I think we're getting warm here. IBM had tried working with external partners before, famously with Microsoft. That didn't end so well for IBM. It helped the IBM PC business do very, very well, but most of the profit went not to the PC business, but went to Microsoft and to Intel. So IBM had seen that movie, and they didn't like the ending very much. So along comes the internet, along come these servers and cloud computing and all the rest. IBM doesn't really want a rerun of that movie. So the bad news is IBM doesn't own Linux. They actually had a version of Unix called AIX that was IBM's flavor of Unix, but AIX was like the number 4 or number 5 operating system at the time. And Linux wasn't owned by IBM, but it was growing, it was taking off like a rocket, and Microsoft didn't own it either. And IBM figured, if we play for a tie in the operating system, and we can get at it to add to it and improve it, to make our stuff run better, we can win somewhere else in the business. And where IBM won in the business is back in IBM Global Services. Because one of the great things about Linux is it runs on lots of people's stuff. And IBM Global Services is basically the idea that it doesn't matter what equipment you've got and who you bought it from. We will help you manage all of it. One-stop shopping for you. Which means behind the scenes, oh my God, what stuff have they got? Where did that come from? How are we going to improve that? It doesn't run with this. It's not compatible with that. What are we going to do? Well, what you do is you go and modify the next generation of these products for the next release, so you get device drivers and other modifications so that it does run with that stuff. And it fixes all those problems. So you don't make money on Linux directly, but you make money on this IBM Global Services business that handles all the servicing of that. So it's an open source business model. An open source business model. Many people think of those things as oxymorons. But as I hope you can see, they actually can be quite compatible. Now, back to your point, Anthony, about the letting internal stuff go outside. Remember all those patents I told you about from the USPTO? IBM regularly gets billions of dollars each year for royalties on its patent portfolio. And this is really high margin revenue. Because apart from keeping a few attorneys to write nasty letters to people, the cost of goods for this is practically zero. So it's pure profit. You know, short of printing currency, I can't think of another business that's got higher profit margins. This is really valuable business for them. And it's $1 billion or more most years in IBM's, it's pure income coming into them. So it's a huge, successful business, and it helps them pay for the next generation of research in the R&D labs too. So now we begin to see a business model that not only supports external technology development, but a business model that helps to support internal technology development as well. So remember, we started by saying the problem with the open model is where's the basic research going to come from? Who can afford to support it? And I said to you, the universities are going to play a big role. I still believe that. But through mechanisms like this, others can play a role as well. So we're starting to have a different adaptation to this open environment. Then we get to the intermediaries, our friends at Innocentive. And we have Cesar Castro here, former employee of Innocentive, who was integrally involved during the formative years, especially when Innocentive was being set up. But what you see with Innocentive, Nine Sigma, and the others is these are great scouting and search technologies for companies trying to bring in external stuff into the things that they need for their business. So I would locate them here, outside the internal technology base, helping to access the external technology base. We also get our friends in the venture capital community that are helping to sell off those acquisitions we were talking about. Those are the guys selling those companies into you to acquire them, that you can take them into your market. And if we get far enough down, our old friends, the investment banks, if you're buying entire companies that are big, are down over here. Then there's a bunch of stuff on the inside-out part where we have intermediaries as well. We haven't seen any of them this semester yet. But there's a company called IP Value that helps companies license out their IP portfolios to others for money, much like IBM, getting that $1 billion or more for its IP. This company typically takes 20% of the revenues they raise, and you get 80%. So they go out and sell your IP portfolio for you. And there are other specialized firms. This is a venture capital firm called New Venture Partners, LLC, that actually works with internal R&D labs to take individual projects out of the lab, fund it, and turn it into a separate startup company that becomes a spin-off. So that's a different view. Rather than the outside coming in through an acquisition here, this is something coming out of the R&D organization and going out to a different market. So they're intermediaries at each part of the open innovation model. And to me, what's kind of interesting about that is that, to me, it's something of a validation that there's something to this model. Because these are organizations that are making their business on enabling aspects of this model. And many of them, like the intermediaries, are relatively recent or IP value. These companies weren't around 15, 20 years ago. Another example, Procter & Gamble. Now, for starters, P&G used to be a very closed organization. Lots of internal R&D, a lot of not invented here thinking, et cetera. How closed were they? They only half-jokingly say, we invented not invented here. You know, we were the first ones to have it, because this company was started in, I think, it's 1846. A very old company by US standards. They, too, had a crisis much like IBM back in the year 2000. They missed a series, not just one estimate, they missed a series of quarterly estimates. And the stock market just crushed them, and they lost their CEO as a result of that. And here's what happened to them in that stock price. So it's, this is a company that makes, soap and toothpaste and toilet paper and, consumer products, a very stable business. And the stock is marching along pretty well, and it goes from a high of $115 a share down to $54 a share in the space of 4 months. So for a business that stable to have that kind of a collapse, that's how your CEO loses his or her job. So lots of companies get into trouble. To P&G's credit, they figured out why they got into trouble and started to do something about it. And the biggest problem they had was not with their current brands. It was that they weren't being successful in developing new brands. They were the number 1 or number 2 in practically every category they were in. And they were in Japan, Western Europe, the US, doing very well in all those. But those markets are only growing 1 or 2% a year demographically. So how do you get that 5 or 7% annual growth that your investors want in a world where your customer base is only growing 1 or 2% and you're the number 1 or number 2 in every category already? The only way you can do it is to get new brands. So to do that, they decided to change their innovation process, and they created something called Connect and Develop, which is P&G's label for outside-in open innovation. And they had a number of successes early on. I'll pick one here that many of you will probably recognize. The Swiffer, it's a household cleaning product. Are you familiar with this, the Swiffer? Some heads nodding yes, some nodding no. I know who does the housework. So the idea of a Swiffer is that when you're done with the mopping, the mop head is detachable and replaceable. So you don't have to throw away the mop. You keep the handle and the attachment, but you just keep putting on new mop heads. And it turns out the technology is very similar to what they used for disposable diapers. So big success for them that way. But P&G didn't invent this. A company in Japan called Unicharm had a product, they didn't call it Swiffer, but they had a product in Japan selling in the market. But Unicharm, being a mid-sized Japanese company, didn't have any distribution outside Japan. So a P&G technology scout found this product, thought it would be a good fit for P&G, did a deal with Unicharm saying, you keep selling it in Japan, give us the rights outside Japan. And today that is a $1 billion brand for Procter & Gamble, for something they didn't invent. But they had the brand, they had the distribution channels, they know how to get the product into the market and all the rest. Big success for them. And the others were of this nature as well. So by getting more new brands, they were able to get that top line growing again instead of continually missing those earnings estimates. They did some other things as well. As a result of this, the CEO who took over from Dirk Jager, who was fired, was a guy named A.G. Lafley. And he made a mandate in 2002 saying, in 5 years, we're going to get 50% of our innovations from outside the company. And the guy inside their R&D organization translated this to saying, there must be more than 1 million people in the world who know about my business. How do I get them on my team? And this technology scouting activity, like the one that found the Swiffer in Japan, had a bunch of technology scouts out there to do that. And then when they would find these, the deals would be done over by the external business development team who would do the contracts and all that stuff over there. So these people would find the technologies, these people would close them, and then P&G would ship them into the market. And this was so successful that Lafley wrote a book in 2008 called Game Changer with a consultant named Ram Charan. Good book, by the way. If you're looking for a book on innovation from a kind of a CEO viewpoint, it's a really well done book. And how often do consumer product company CEOs write books about innovation? To my knowledge, it's the only time I can ever think of it happening. So it shows you how much he thought they had accomplished. It was such a good idea that he's now taking the credit for it. I know, a little slow on that. Anyway, it did get the share price back. Some other things helped the share price too, but basically, by going through that analysis and getting growth back, it really helped P&G. And now they are really among the world leaders, I would say, in practicing open innovation. And we have, I think, Ashish Chatterjee coming here in April to come talk to us. He's the current head of Connect and Develop for Procter & Gamble. So you'll hear from him directly in April. He probably won't tell you much about the financial crisis and all the bad times, but now you know. And they are doing some great stuff. And one of the reasons why I think Procter & Gamble has been as open as they've been about what they're doing is they want to become branded as the open innovation company. If you've got an idea for a consumer product business or a new kind of a product, who's the first company you're going to call? They want to be that company. I think that's one of the reasons they've been fairly aggressive about promoting it. It's not, again, it's not to be nice. It's not just to teach us all how to do innovation better. It's because they think they can make money off of it. I think that's why they're telling us about it. Okay, different industry, different company, Air Products. Any of you know Air Products? A few of you? Okay, good. So they make industrial gases. And like the other examples you've heard so far, strong internal tradition of internal innovation. And they had an opportunity about a decade ago to acquire what was then British Oxygen. And that opportunity required them to kind of take a whole rethinking of their entire R&D function. And as it happened, the guy who did the rethinking the acquisition didn't end up going through. But as a result of the thought process, they still decided to re-engineer their innovation process to do that. And adding fuel to the fire was the fact that their business was commoditizing quite a bit. Industrial chemicals are sold on a bulk quantity basis. So you're typically shipping hopper cars and rail cars to railheads at the customer's site, and you get paid per car for these bulk gases. So it's pretty commodity-like. Meanwhile, the energy and feedstocks going into these are going up and up and up. So you're getting pressure on your price from your customer going down. Your input costs are going higher and higher. You're getting squeezed in the middle. So they started thinking about, wait, we got to do something. It wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It's like, how do we get back in the business of adding value for customers before we get commoditized out of existence? And so what they realized from the customer perspective is these customers buying these bulk chemicals are putting them into very important value-added manufacturing processes. And one of the reasons the customers like to buy in bulk is they don't want the line to shut down. You want to keep that line running as much as possible. Anytime you have downtime, oh boy, you're paying a lot of money. But Air Products actually knows a lot more about how to handle gases than most of its customers do, because they do it for a living. And they see it in a wide range of environments and temperatures and operating conditions and you name it. So they felt there was a lot of knowledge they could take advantage of with their customer. But the way they were selling the product, their incentive was the exact opposite. The more the customer wasted the gas, the sooner you could ship the next car to them. So in a weird way, they were not only getting paid, they were not getting paid for their knowledge. They were the dumber their customer was, or the more wasteful the customer was, the more you could ship to them. So they had to kind of reverse that whole dynamic. And so what they decided to do was stop selling bulk gas, but sell gas at the point in the manufacturing process where you want it, and help sell uptime on those manufacturing processes, and then create rewards for all this. And they started doing things like investing in dedicated facilities adjacent to the customer premises, and then creating these build, own, operate agreements where typically for the, you'd build it for a couple of years, you'd operate it for 10 or 15 years, and at the conclusion of the contract, it becomes the property of your customer. And then you service it from that point on for the customer, but it's their stuff. And so customers like it because they get this dedicated equipment. It helps support the uptime for them. You put the capital in for the customer, and the customer essentially gets it at the end of the agreement, either for some small payment or something subsidized, so they don't have to pay the full fixed cost of it. So it makes a nice business for you. Your customers doing this are pretty locked in. They're not going to easily change suppliers. And it gets you back in the business of adding value and out of the commodity pressures that they were fighting. And then there was the IP. They actually changed the way they dealt with the IP as well. In the beginning, the businesses owned all the IP assets, but as a practical matter, what that meant was nothing ever got licensed out. Everything was kept in, whether it was used or not. And this is quite typical, by the way. If you're wondering about your company or a company that you know, one metric you can actually ask is, how many patents do you own? Of all those patents, how many are licensed outside your business? And you'll often find it's a very, very small percentage. And that was true here too. So they decided in this rethink after the acquisition didn't go through that they were going to take it away from the businesses and treat them as corporate assets, which meant that the corporation would decide how best to use them and whether or not to license them out. And a guy named John Tao got the great job title of Vice President of Open Innovation, perhaps my favorite job title. And he started small, and he wanted to get success before asking for lots of money, but he began to start doing some of these things, bringing in some success, sort of the equivalent of Swiffer, but it didn't become $1 billion business right away. These became sort of $1 million, tens of millions of dollars, and then as it grew, he got more resources to keep it going. And here's a more recent one that's kind of fun, called the large-scale vortex. And this is like a car here, if you're trying to get a sense of scale of these things. This is like a 5 or 6 story structure in terms of the size of it. So it's $100 million of capital equipment you'd put at the end of a process to scrub effluents out of the air by burning them out. And this is kind of a schematic of how it works. And this was a technology that Air Products developed. And Air Products' own facilities make gases, so they use stuff like this. But the plant managers at these plants didn't want to use it because it was $100 million to build it. And it hadn't been proven anywhere, by the way. So why spend the money? So John Tao said, okay, can I take it outside and see if anybody will use it on the outside? And with this new structure, the corporation gave him the permission to try to license it outside. And a company named John Zink took a license to it and started getting installations of this large-scale vortex in other companies. And a funny thing happened. Once other companies' plants started installing this stuff, the Air Products plant managers got a whole new attitude about it. It's like, oh, gee, maybe we should get one of those for ourselves. And so instead of having it sit on the shelf, by licensing it outside, they actually demonstrated its use in other companies, and that changed the attitude of the people inside the company toward the technology. So sometimes people think that the people inside, I have all the best ideas. That's the kind of the not invented here idea. This is kind of another different syndrome where sometimes, okay, our R&D guys invented it, but who are they? What do they know about what the market wants and the market needs, et cetera? Seeing it demonstrated and proven outside made it more interesting inside. So this now became not only successful externally, but now it's being deployed internally as well. And my last example, how many of you here shop at Amazon? Anybody not shop at Amazon? All right, well, I'm going to give you, in 2 slides, I'm going to tell you why so many of us shop at Amazon. There's multiple explanations, but this stuff ties back to open innovation in a services context. So Gene, correct me if I missed some points on this one. Amazon, of course, started off selling books. And Amazon buys and merchandises and inventories the books that it sells in their warehouses. But if you want to go and buy something else on Amazon, chances are most of that other stuff, Amazon doesn't actually stock that stuff. They actually get it from some third party. Except the third party actually ships it directly to you. It doesn't actually pass through Amazon's distribution center. It comes directly from the third party. So if you're buying jewelry, for example, Amazon has a whole bunch of jewelry on their site. None of it is merchandised, inventoried by Amazon. It all comes from third parties. And what you see here is the web page that Amazon puts up for its merchants, the third-party merchants who want to access the web store to build the web pages for the merchandise that they want to put on Amazon's site. So the reason all this stuff looks identical to us, whether we're buying books or jewelry, it all looks the same, is they have access to the exact same web page tools that Amazon uses to build its own web pages. So unsurprisingly, the stuff looks and feels just like everything else Amazon does. So for us as consumers, it's the same experience. So while we're on the site over here, oh, we could also go over there and test this out. It's all the same checkout, etc. Now Amazon does the billing and collection, and because it's a consistent experience, we shop more. They get more of our wallet. More share of wallet is kind of the marketing term for that. And best of all for Amazon, they get this extra spending without taking on extra risk in inventory or merchandising. The third party's taking on all that. Amazon simply collects the money. So, and they collect the money, by the way, before they spend the money to the third party. So from a cash flow standpoint, this is also very positive because they get your money before they start spending any of theirs. So it's a very positive business with a lot less risk. What limits most stores is the more stuff you stock, the more chances are you're going to have the wrong stuff. Or stuff, and you're going to be out of stock on the stuff customers want. You're going to have too much of stuff customers don't want. You got to run these big sales to unload the stuff that you don't want to have. So you run a loss on all that. All that risk is somebody else's problem in the Amazon structure because of this. So they create a store, they open up the APIs and the web page tools for other people to use. They build the pages, and off they go. Yeah?
They also have a reasonably effective recommender engine.
Yeah.
They have a recommender engine that does a reasonable job, and so that generates additional sales. I would say about maybe 15 or 20% of what I buy from Amazon comes from the recommender engine.
Yeah, how many of you have used that recommender engine? Yeah, okay. I agree. I think it's a big help. But that's only half of the story for Amazon. This is, if you will, sort of outside in again. We're taking other people's merchandise and putting it on our website. So that's kind of the outside in, now in a service context. Next, after I take this really good question, we're going to talk about the inside out part of Amazon.
I'm just curious about how does it differ from the eBay model?
Oh, I'm not sure. Well, there are differences between Amazon and eBay, but in this idea, eBay doesn't have any books. Right? There's no distribution center for eBay. Everything is from somebody else. So in that regard, it's quite similar to eBay. And in fairness, eBay got there before Amazon. So good point. But here's the inside-out part of Amazon. They build all these server farms to handle all the traffic to their website, because Amazon's one of the busiest websites anywhere in the world. So they have to have a lot of infrastructure to handle it. But some very clever people at Amazon realized a few years ago that the demand is actually very spiky. And a lot of in order to handle the spikes, we have to build a lot of excess capacity that we don't use most of the time. So we have a lot of idle infrastructure on average. So what if we created a business to rent out space on the infrastructure? And that went through a few names and a few changes, but it basically is Amazon Web Services or Amazon Elastic Cloud and so on and so forth. The idea is we will take what we've built for ourselves and rent it out to you. So you can do your website. We'll run your website if you want, almost like IBM Global Services. They'll do as much of it as you let them do, And what this does is it converts the fixed cost for a customer of having to buy a facility, buy the equipment, hire a manager, bring it all up, sign all the contracts to get it to go. All those fixed costs are now variable costs. You only pay for what you use. And all the fixed costs were already spent by Amazon. It also increases Amazon's utilization of its servers. So instead of averaging maybe 20, 30, 40% utilization, now it can get up 60, 70, 80% utilization. So that spreads the fixed costs much more widely. And now it's a big business for Amazon. And all the stuff around cloud computing we hear about today, they got in early, 5, 6 years ago. And many of the Wall Street analysts that followed the company when they were doing this thought these guys were nuts, because they were spending a lot more money on their IT infrastructure than an internet retailer needed to spend. So why are you wasting all your money? Give it back to the shareholders. Don't do this crazy stuff. And to Amazon management's great credit, they had a vision that they weren't able to explain, and they certainly weren't able to prove it early on. But as it turned out being, it's a big successful business, and now everybody wants to be in the business Amazon's doing. Yes?
I've actually heard that whenever Amazon Web Services launches a new feature, you kind of know what Amazon has been up to. So they usually launch something because they've internally been using it.
Oh, yes.
The outside in, you kind of get some insight.
Well, that would be inside out. We've already been using it. Now we're going to take it to the outside.
Right.
So it's inside out thinking. And a lot of businesses don't think this way. A lot of businesses think if we've got something that we're really good at, we want to keep it to ourselves, because that's part of how we have a competitive advantage against our competitors. We've got it, they don't. But Amazon's got a different attitude. It's like, we've got it, you can have it too. Now, you get to have it at our price, so we get to set the price, thank you very much. And so not only do we get margin from you, we also get more utilization, which spreads our fixed costs, so we make profit from you and we lower our costs at the same time, kind of a double positive whammy for the bottom line. But that's a different way of thinking about competition than traditional thinking would have you have. Most of the time you'd keep that to yourself and you wouldn't share it. And the Amazon folks thought differently about it. So I give them real credit for that. All right, so now I think I'm through my examples. So this gets back to not just open innovation, but innovation more generally. What is innovation? I think many of us had a view of innovation that was kind of technically based, if you will. Based on the idea of invention, that man of genius, manifesting itself in a product driven by the technology that we create ourselves, and we dedicate of people in engineering whose job it is to do this. So they are the ones responsible for innovation. And I see lots of companies, even today, startup companies among others, where who's responsible for innovation in your company? It's the engineering folks. They're the ones who own it. Well, that's, I think, a rather incomplete view. Because in a sense, innovation really isn't done until the invention has been commercialized and taken into the market, until a customer actually buys it. As you've already heard from me a lot today, that means there's some business elements to it beyond the technology pieces. And that includes both the process technology, but especially the business model that commercializes that technology. If you take the same technology and you put it to the market through two different business models, you're going to get two different outcomes, even though it's the same technology. Instead of it being internally generated, I think innovation today is about the internal integration of both internal and external stuff. This is another reason why you still need smart people internally. If you have a world where there's lots of useful stuff all over the place, the ways that all that stuff can be combined go up in a combinatorial fashion. So it actually grows faster than an exponential. It gets very complex very quickly. So how do you figure out how to put these things together in a way that makes sense, that solves a real problem? The people who have skills in system integration, system architecture, putting all these pieces, both external and internal, together, this is, I think, a really important source of value in a world of open innovation. And that means because of the business stuff, because of the integration stuff, it isn't just engineering. It's everybody's job. And so you really need in your company a culture of innovation that's not given to one department, but actually goes across the organization to really do this well. A little shameless self-promotion. When I wrote the book back in 2003, I actually did a search on the term open innovation on Google, and I got back about 200 page links at the time. And most of those page links at the time announced that, company such and such opened their innovation center here or there. So the word open and the word innovation were in the same sentence, but having those two things side by side didn't have any particular meaning as of April 2003. When I did this search last year when I was publishing my book, I did the same term on the same search engine, and I got 22 million page links. And there were still some about company so-and-so opening up their innovation center here or there, but most of them were about this new model of innovation that we've just been describing. On a qualitative basis, I went out on LinkedIn and I did a search on open innovation, just among the companies that were in my little LinkedIn list. And I found 3 examples from 3 wildly different industries. One from a chocolate company, one from a software company, and one, yes, from a defense contractor. Even defense contractors are getting interested in open innovation now. So it really is getting quite expansive. If you haven't been to this page, I highly suggest it. openinnovation.berkeley.edu. That's where all things open innovation at Berkeley are gathered together. It's where all the videos you'll find for this course are housed. You'll also find electronic copies of all the papers that I've written on open innovation. They're all there, except for ones where we couldn't get permission from Harvard Business Review. So there you only get the abstracts. And that's a business model and IP thing again. So there's a lot of stuff out there. We have all kinds of good activities. So if you're just trying to get up to date on that stuff, that's going on. And continuing today, we also have our tweet at OpenInno. So we're tweeting all the lectures. We're trying to capture questions too from this as well. And I also will post stuff that I just see out there in the world that I think are interesting examples of open innovation, or maybe a conference. So last year in Africa, in Nigeria, Lagos, there was the world's first conference on open innovation in Africa. So I have a little tweet to the conference proceedings of that. So if you're looking for really arcane stuff like that, check out the Twitter stream on OpenInno. And we're actually, I think, up over 11,000 followers now. So it's not Ashton Kutcher, but it's okay. Other organizations, as you might expect with an open innovation talk, it isn't only about Berkeley, right? I mean, not all the smart people are at Berkeley either. This is the National Endowment for Science and Technology in the UK, a government-funded research organization that actually is creating a presence on the top open 100 companies judged by nominations from the crowd, so to speak. So you've heard about crowdsourcing. This is another application of crowdsourcing, just trying to list who are the most open companies out there. So that's just another manifestation of this. Do I have anything more? Or is that it? Geez, I think I'm frozen here. Okay. So there are 3 books on it so far. More probably coming. This was the original one. This is the one that's more business model focused, and this is the one more focused on services. So for those of you who are looking for more stuff to read, there's plenty of it. I have asked you all to read this book for this class. So if you haven't read it, and then you turn in your 5-page paper, and it's clear to me you never opened it, that might be a problem for you, but maybe not. Maybe you're just great students in class. So those are my prepared remarks. Let's just take some time for those questions that you've been dying to ask. Yes?
Well, back in the early 80s, IBM created the Open Architecture PC, which was really the start of the whole PC business. And basically the business ran away and left IBM in the dust,
right,
perhaps leading to the 1992 debacle in part. And so I'm wondering, is this a cautionary tale about open innovation?
Yeah, so the IBM PC example is, I think, a cautionary tale of IBM did some very open things for the time. They did it very well. And initially, it worked really, really well. The first few years of sales were fantastic. And IBM was Fortune's most admired company in 1983 and 1984. They went right past Apple and the Apple II, which were the market leaders at the time, in, I think, geez, in just 2 or 3 years from nothing. So it was a huge success. And then, as we've said earlier, the profits began to move away from IBM and toward Microsoft and Intel. So it did kind of run away and was a cautionary tale, I think. So some...
Great lesson to be learned.
Yeah, there are entire papers written on that subject, some of them by me, but too much to answer, and I want to get a few other questions in before we wrap up. So, okay, but this is your chance. Those questions you've been thinking about? Yes?
I heard that the Amazon used to host the website for Target,
Yeah.
which is a competitor of Amazon, but Target started to build their own website instead. So is there any limit of this kind of open services?
Right, so Target and Amazon is an interesting case because Amazon was hosting it, and then after a while, Target thought, why are we giving all of our business? Because remember, when that relationship started, Amazon was selling a lot fewer things. You know, if it was Amazon was selling books, I mean, Target doesn't care about books, that's fine. But then they start adding category after category after category. Pretty soon, Amazon looks like more and more and more of a competitor to Target. And Target also realized Amazon knows more about our online customers than we do. That's the other thing that's really annoying if you're Target. Now, if you're a smaller company, I think you're happy to have Amazon take all those headaches off your shoulders. But if you're a big company, and a big company is competing with Amazon, can you afford to give them all that knowledge, all those transactions, all that traffic, and profit as well off of you? I think that's where companies like Target get concerned. So are there limits to being open? I think for Amazon, they're being very clever about it. I think for people like Target, if they can find a deal with a Google or a Microsoft or an IBM or some other cloud computing companies that maybe are more benign, that might be a better fit for them. Because I think you do have to think about what's the intention of my partner here. Would they love for me to be successful and grow and prosper, or would they be happy to see me crash and burn? And if they really are pretty okay about you crashing and burning, maybe that's not the right partner for you in the long run. But that's not an indictment of open innovation. That's just saying this is not, it's not as simple as to say open is good and closed is bad, and so everybody be open and we'll all be happy. There are competitive aspects, there are strategic interactions with all this stuff. You've got to learn about the motivations and intentions of the people you collaborate with. So, but good question. Okay, I think we are out of time, so I'll look forward to any write-ups you guys do in the next week or so, and we'll see you next week where we have Professor Wim van Haverbeke from Hasselt University and Asade Business School will be our presenter next week.